Right, so how many times have we heard accusations, usually from pro-Zionist sources, that Hamas have infiltrated bodies to push their nefarious end goals? They were accused of infiltrating the UN aid agency UNRWA, as a very well-known example, of course. Not that Israel could present any evidence, and as such, even staunch pro-Israeli nations like Germany even have restored funding to UNRWA by this point, though some nations are still holding out, defying logic or common sense, such as the US and the UK. But if we look towards the university campuses, where particularly in the US we've seen scenes of horrendous violence perpetrated by the police against students, there have also been claims that some of these students are indoctrinated and are acting as proxies for Hamas. But in a shock announcement relating specifically at this point to Columbia University in New York, coming from New York's mayor at that, the violence on that particular campus, where this student movement of demanding divestment from Israel of their universities began, the violence seen there was instigated by a member of the university's own faculty, apparently, who it seems is an Israeli spy. So who is it doing the infiltrating, really? Hamas or Israel? Right, so this story is so believable, so typical of Israel, frankly, to actually be the ones doing what they are accusing others of, hiding in plain sight, and there seems to be no reason to disbelieve this, given that this seems to have come from New York's mayor, Eric Adams, who praised the action, it should be pointed out, so he's glorifying this, not condemning it, and that we are being told by him that a member of the Columbia University teaching staff is actually spy for Israel, in effect. But even worse than that, is also a leading figure in the New York Police Department, so that's a two for the price of one infiltration then, within positions of significant power in New York City, and does beg the question of how many more of these Israeli agents, potentially, if we can call them that, are there in positions of power across the US now, or indeed elsewhere? And how much power do they actually have to bring to bear for the sake of another nation, against, in this case, US citizens? How are these people being promoted to such positions, and who is authorising that? And indeed, are they doing so knowing where their true allegiances might lie? Well, the staff member in question that we're talking about here in this instance at Columbia University is one Rebecca Weiner, an adjunct professor of international and public affairs at SIPA, which is the School of International and Public Affairs, part of Columbia University. However, last year, Weiner was also made Deputy Commissioner for Intelligence and Counterterrorism of the NYPD, putting her in the unique position of literally being able to police Columbia University and those on it, seemingly in the interests of the Israeli state. How do we know that? Well, according to Weiner's blurb on the SIPA website, she develops policy and strategic priorities for the Intelligence and Counterterrorism Bureau and publicly represents the NYPD in matters involving counterterrorism and intelligence. You might be interested to know, therefore, that according to news website The Grey Zone, who appear to be the only outlet at time of writing covering this story, that the NYPD Intelligence and Counterterrorism Bureau maintains an office in, of all places, Tel Aviv. This Tel Aviv office apparently acts as a liaison between the NYPD, the New York Police Department, and Israeli security. For what possible purpose? It's a head-scratcher, isn't it? With Weiner as the go-between. Here's an excerpt from the Grey Zone story explaining how that worked. A 2011 AP investigation revealed that a so-called demographics unit operated secretly within the NYPD's Counterterrorism Intelligence Bureau. This shadowy outfit spied on Muslims around the New York City area, and even on students at campuses outside the state who were involved in Palestine solidarity activism. The unit was developed in tandem with the CIA, which has refused to name the former Middle East station chief it posted in the senior ranks of the NYPD's intelligence division. The demographics unit appears to have been inspired by Israeli intelligence as well. As a former police official told the AP, the unit attempted to map the city's human terrain through a program modelled in part on how Israeli authorities operate in the West Bank. A lawyer by training, Weiner oversaw negotiations between the NYPD and lawyers for local Muslims who had their civil liberties violated by its demographics unit. So how does all this relate to the police involvement on Columbia University campus then? Well, according to NYPD reporter for independent news outlet WNYC, Bahar Ostadan, in a tweet dating back to the end of January, so well before these protests on US campuses began, the NYPD liaison in Israel has sent hourly updates to NYPD headquarters in Lower Manhattan since the October 7th Hamas attacks in Israel, per NYPD Deputy Commissioner of Intelligence and Counterterrorism Rebecca Weiner. Not since 9/11 has a singular act of terrorism galvanized such a broad array of violent extremism, she said about the October 7th attacks. Certainly that gives some idea of her views and where she receives intelligence from. And of course, by the time those campus protests began, and certainly those at Columbia began, we now have an idea of the sort of person who is in a position of not only being on campus at her SEPA office, but having the police at her fingertips to move in and act. As Eric Adams himself reportedly said, she was the one that was monitoring the situation, Adams explained, adding that the crackdown was carried out after her team was able to conduct an investigation. Right, an investigation, eh? What sort of investigation was that then?
This is not about students expressing ideas. It is about a change in tactics that presents a concern and a normalization and mainstreaming of rhetoric. And I'm not just talking about language, I'm now talking about tactics. And that's what shifted our response yesterday. But a normalization and mainstreaming of rhetoric associated with terrorism that has now become pretty common on college campuses, right? You see people wearing headbands associated with foreign terrorist organizations. This happened in October when you had a viral TikTok reissuing of Osama bin Laden's 2002 letter to America. So that's a larger concern. It's separate from what happened yesterday, but they're related. We do not want ideas. We do not want campuses, which are where people are supposed to be learning and being in a conducive environment for all of the things that we do in schools, being turned into places where people are committing vandalism, property damage, and committing crimes.
So the language and rhetoric being used on campus wasn't political speech, wasn't defending a political viewpoint, wasn't taking a stance against genocide even. It was terrorism, apparently. Oh, and she blamed TikTok too, just because of the ban in the US on the cards. Let's get social media to carry some of the can too, otherwise how else would many of us worldwide be so well informed and seeing with our own eyes the atrocity happening in Gaza at Israel's hands? Whilst Israel has literally, it seemed, got itself a spook planted not just in Columbia University who teaches about counter-terrorism, or is that what passes for it as far as Israel is concerned, but is also able to act upon it as she sees it within the ranks of the NYPD too. And we saw what happened there as a result of that. Incidentally, the TikTok terrorism case she mentioned there, the guy implicated in that, Sami al-Arian, was a Palestinian academic and he was never convicted of terrorism. So that was just a blatant lie on Wiener's part. But the peak bit of hypocrisy came from Mayor Eric Adams again, as Grey Zone also reported. Throughout the press conference, Mayor Adams repeatedly cast the city's crackdown on student speech as the only possible solution to ongoing campus encampments, citing undefined threats to the minds of impressionable youth. There is a movement to radicalise young people, and I'm not going to wait until it's done and all of a sudden acknowledge the existence of it, Adams proclaimed. Young people are being influenced by those who are professionals at radicalising our children, he insisted, without specifying. And I'm not going to allow that to happen as the mayor of the city of New York. After angrily proclaiming that his uncle died defending this country, Adams declared, "It's despicable that schools will allow another country's flag to fly in our country." However, as an enthusiastic participant in New York City's annual Celebrate Israel parade, Adams is no stranger to waving another country's flag. And indeed, here he is, flying the flag of another country just last June. If we're going to talk about infiltration by foreign state actors and terrorism, then we can't ignore the fact it is clearly Israel very much doing that as exposed here. And the power that some, certainly, like Rebecca Weiner, can bring to bear, seemingly in that state's interest, against the word, beliefs and convictions of America's young people. They'll never forgive or forget what is happening here, and I should imagine it certainly won't stop them either. The scary thing is, we just don't know how far the US state is prepared to go for Israel against its own people. Last time I looked, that's called treason, and it's also playing out in real time on social media. At least here in the UK, the law is acting on the side of our students, or at least a legal group representing the interests of Palestinians are, as they've sent out letters to 82 universities across the country urging them to divest from their Israeli investments or face potential notices of liability. To find out more about that story here, I hope to catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.